Welcome to Teachers Talk Texts, the podcast where English teachers share their insights and interpretations of texts currently studied in BCE English. I'm your host, Clare Mackey. Let's dive into today's episode.
Hello, my name is Carla Ziino. I'm on maternity leave from Lowther Anglican Grammar School. Hello, big thank you, first of all, to Elizabeth Rhodes, the principal, who's also a Gun English teacher, and the whole Year 12 English team. A lot of what I know about this novel, I know from those people who I've taught alongside for many years now. Particularly dedicate this to Cathy Maloney, who passed away last week. She had been teaching for many decades, loved talking about texts, was also a VCAR assessor, so assessed English and GATS for many, many years. So this is for you, Cathy, predominantly. And I will say that one of her favourite quotes ever was, "Ignore the background information at your peril." So that's got something to do with section C, not section A, which is what we're going to talk about. But that's for you, Cathy. I know you'd love me to talk about that. So that's a little gem for anyone that does English, because not everyone's going to write on all the lines, but you all have to write on section C. Don't forget that little box. Thank you.
Hi, Carla. Thanks so much for coming on Teachers Talk Texts. It's really great to have you, and I'm very excited to talk all the light we cannot see today. But yeah, let's jump in. Let's jump in wherever you want. We can start from the very beginning, or we can start from the end. What suits you?
Well, this is one of those texts. Forgive me if I just rat you out here, but this is what we do as teachers.
Absolutely.
If teachers are hearing this, or if hopefully your students are tuning in, we were just talking about this novel and how overwhelming it can be, not only because of its size, but because it comes with the Pulitzer Prize that won, what did you say, 2015, was it?
2015, yeah.
Can I say, I'm going to do some shout outs here. I read this novel in about 2 nights in the summer holidays, which is really the only time I get to read. And I think that I was then. That was also a benefit. But it was recommended to me by a dear friend of mine who's actually a maths teacher. So Tanya Christensen gave it to me. She said, "You must read this novel." So it was way before it was on the English text list, and I fell in love with it. And it was one of those things that I could not put it down, even though it was so long. Once you get into it, and I've said this to the students now since it's been on the list for a couple of years, please just give it a chance. Even though it's long, it spans decades, really, even though it kind of jumps back and forth in time. Once you fall in love with these characters, well, this has been my experience anyway, I adore these characters. However, I read it first for pleasure, and I loved it because I found it a pleasurable read. But then when Vate asked me to write the study guide for it, and all of a sudden I had to read it for school, and I was on maternity leave then too, so I was a bit out of practice, it was the hardest slog rereading it. So I get it now. I finally get what it's like to be a student. You know, I mean, of course I was a student 20 years ago, but...
Who can remember back that far, really, you know?
Oh, yes, it feels like this year's been 20 years, to be honest. So I get it. I get both sides. I get those kids who have devoured it in a couple of nights, but I also understand hard slog. I think Fate gave me about 4 or 5 months to write the study guide, and it took me that long, you know, and I actually hated it when I reread it, because I was like, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to actually make sense of this now for teachers to try and teach it, you know. And it's an overwhelming read in many ways, because there are loads of characters. I don't speak French, you know, so I'm going to apologise to another dear colleague of mine, Richard Hunt. I actually asked him to give me French pronunciation lessons at the start of this year, and he did, but that was, again, 6 months ago.
Yeah.
And a lot has happened since the start of the year, so my apologies to any French speakers. I'm going to absolutely massacre character and place names, but I will try my best. But yeah, there's a lot of characters, a lot happens, it jumps back and forth in time. I don't know if you can start at the beginning with this book, because it doesn't start at the beginning. You know, it starts kind of halfway through.
It does.
So it doesn't matter. I'm happy to start wherever it seems
appropriate.
Wherever it's appropriate. I will say, though, having taught it, for a couple of years, the end, that last kind of couple of chapters where students might, for example, decide that happens after the war, it happens decades after, that's actually my favourite part of the book. And I actually think if teachers and students, I don't have any, again, another caveat, I've got none of us as teachers have any secret weapons. We don't know what the questions are going to be.
No, you're right. That's so true.
Assessors will always say, with a novel, with a film, with a play, whatever it might be, you need to appreciate it as a construction or a work that has, a beginning, middle and an end. Even though this is out of order, you need to acknowledge that. It's not chronological. I think it would be remiss as students just to forget that Anthony Doerr decided to have these extra chapters at the end dedicated to the aftermath of the war for only a few key characters. Obviously, some of them are no longer with us by the 70s and then by the 21st century. So, yeah, I would say that I've had students that are tempted to not read the whole thing or just to read the study guide or just to go, nah, that's not important. The important part is World War II. And, of course, that is the bulk of the book. You can't, equally you can't ignore that. But you can't ignore the fact that he does decide to jump 30, 40, 50 years after World War II, because I think that's really, and I'm going to preempt another question, so I'm going to let you talk for a sec, but that's really why he's written the book, as a message to us, in 2020, well, not 2020 because he wrote it in 2015 or whenever it was, you know what I mean,
Mm-hmm.
as a message to current generations to, think about the impact of war and think about racism and segregation and, fascism and all of those sorts of things. And I might say that for all the disadvantages of being a Year 12 student in 2020, I think we might understand some of these characters a little bit more because we've also, been in lockdown, all these sorts of things. So maybe just a little bit of a nugget, an oyster of understanding that maybe last year's students didn't have. Who knows?
Do you know, when I was reading this in preparation to discuss this text with you today, I was thinking that very thing, that the experiences that we've had this year have helped reposition perhaps the way that I am interpreting this text.
Mm-hmm.
Had I read it, as I said to you before we got started, I bought this book in 2016 and it's sat there beautifully on my bookshelf ever since. I may have read it with a very different lens, maybe much more distance perhaps to the way that I approached it over the last couple of weeks in reading. But I want to take you back to something you were saying just now about this idea that the text is a construction, because I think that's really what you've touched on there is really, really important. And the fact that Doerr does, it's almost like he's written a story and then he's kind of got his scissors out and snipped it. And from a cynical perspective might be, and then he just kind of just ordered it in whatever the way it fell. He just threw them all on the ground and put the book together. But that's not what he's done. We know this. Yeah. So if I'm a student and I'm approaching this text, what interpretation can I make about the way that he's structured his narrative? It's non-linear, it's cyclical but not. It's fragmented. It's we've got multiple narrative perspectives. How do I package that as an analyst of this text?
I think that first of all, I could give you my interpretation, but what we're looking for is a unique student voice. So, of course, your teacher will say maybe something different to what my interpretation is. Doesn't mean it's incorrect. You might have a different position to a teacher. Doesn't mean it's incorrect. Doesn't mean you could say you're wrong, miss. But for me, just for what it's worth, probably very little. I think as a student approaching this text, I've had students, for example, jot it out all in a linear way, right? So they go, what's the first thing we know? And the first chapter, so it starts at 0 and then it goes to 1. And I think it's almost, I think I wrote in the study guide, it's almost got connotations of ground zero. Like this is 0 is when it all happens. The bombing, that's about to take place. There's a siege on the city. They're all coming in and the pamphlets are dropping saying evacuate some other, sorry, Richard Hunch, it's something like that. At least I'm not saying St. Marlow, but hey, again, assessors don't care. Try and
what we care about though is spelling it correctly, right? It doesn't matter if you pronounce the French, spell it correctly.
So you know what? St. Marlow probably, and you'd probably get it right. So that's cool. But of course, that's the important event. That is the event that brings, I guess, all of those. You talked about different narrative voices. The three main narrative voices, of course, are Marie-Laure, Werner, and again, I don't care if you call him Werner because that's how you're going to remember it. And also the diamond dealer, Von Rumpel.
Von Rumpel. What a name.
Yeah. Great name. I think he's one where, obviously, for much of the text, it alternates between the two young protagonists, of course, Marie-Laure and Werner. And Von Rumpel just kind of, again, he's another one. It's a construction. Some kids just choose to ignore him, and sometimes it might be appropriate too. But again, he's in there for a reason. We'll touch on that for a sec. But it really starts in earnest, I guess, in chapter 1 or section 1, whatever you're going to call it. Again, it doesn't matter as long as you're consistent. It's a very long, it's the longest section of the novel. There's 14 sections, but section 1 is the longest in terms of the page numbers, but also in the decade or so that it spans. So we get to see, Marie-Laure and Werner as young children in their formative years. And I guess we are allowed as an audience an insight into what makes them tick. Seemingly opposite ends of the spectrum. One's a boy, one's a girl. And even in section 0, we get a chapter called the boy and a chapter called the girl. It's quite binary. But really, if we distill it, they're two young people who are kind of at this moment in history where, there seems to be, they're on the precipice of war, but they're still growing up, right? We've got Werner, who is in an orphanage with his sister Jutta, and he is very curious about the world around him. And then, of course, you've got Marie-Laure, who is not quite blind at the start, but she's getting there. And then, of course, she becomes totally blind. But again, she's curious about the world around her. But she, I guess, because of her father's job at the Natural History Museum, she's able to access a lot more. But she's also just curious. She's a curious kid. They're both curious kids. She's curious about the exhibits in Dr. Gaffard's kind of office, the snails and all the rest of it. He's curious about engineering and mechanics and is adamant that he doesn't want to die like his father did down in the mines of his coal mining town. So at their heart, the boy and the girl, one French, one German, again, if you've got even a very basic knowledge of World War II, they're the Germans were the enemies of the Allies in France, of course. But at its heart, I think what Doerr was trying to do, and he's got a bit of criticism actually, that, we should put the young German, as a protagonist alongside this, young blind French girl who was part of the resistance. But I think he was trying to warn us about how easy it is to be led, particularly when, I guess what we see in Paris, where Marie-Laure is, we see a very opulent kind of life that gets taken away from them, and of course they have to flee their little corner of the world. And then quite a contrast to that you get in this kind of pretty desolate kind of mining town. You start getting these people with their crisp uniforms, and that there's a moment in that first section where all of a sudden there's meat again, so it's always this rise of fascists. And you can understand maybe nowadays, and being kind of in an election year in the United States, for example, maybe you can understand how when things are a bit dire, when we're in lockdown, whatever it might be, how you might hold on to ideas. If they're going to say, we're going to make you rich, you don't have to go to the mines, you can get an education elsewhere. Sure, you're going to have to, down the track, there's some unpleasantness that might happen, but there's that whole idea that how easy it is to be manipulated. And Werner, I think, Doerr is an American writer. He did spend a lot of time in Europe writing the book, though. And I think it is a warning that otherwise very intelligent people can you know, and even though Werner always kind of has this conscience, you know, tested by Frederick, by Jutta, by himself, he still goes along with it for most of the novel. So I think it's a warning that it's, yeah, you know, we all say we would be the resistance. We all say we would go against it, even if it cost us our own lives. But when push comes to shove, it's not easy. Would we? Would you?
Would we?
Hopefully we will, to test that. And I think that that's what Doerr wants us to consider, that these are just ordinary people in extraordinary times. So I think that's the main kind of message of the book, really, in a nutshell. For me, I don't think you can just say it's a linear thing, you know, because of course Werner's story ends, you know, he dies, you know, not long after that, of course, when they first meet. But Marie-Laure's continues. She's an old woman by the end. Most of the others are probably dead. But she has a grandson, you know, and it's important that, you know, that this legacy continues. I don't think you can treat it like a beginning, middle and end, because that's not how Doerr constructed it. And it's a bit like when you're at an interview or when you meet someone for the first time and they say, so what's your story? Well, not many people would start with, well, I was born on X day. Yeah. You know, it swings and roundabouts, and these are lives where it's messy, and there's not we don't get a resolution for a lot of the characters in this novel, and that's life. It's messy, it's complicated, and I think the fact that we meet each of the characters and we keep going back to this formative, this kind of zero, this ground zero, Saint-Malo, as it's about to be bombarded, when it's happening, and then of course when they do finally meet, when, you know, maybe Werner does get his redemptive kind of knight in shining armour status when he rescues Marie-Laure from von Rumpel. I think what we do see there is just humanity cut back, yeah? So we've got, you know, Werner and Volkheimer. Again, Volkheimer is this kind of giant of a man who's really high in the regime, and yet when we're first exposed to him, he's kind of this father figure to Werner, who's this, he shouldn't even be there. He's too young, you know, but he's very, very talented at intercepted enemy communication, so that's why he's there. You know, you've got Marie-Laure, who's all alone. She doesn't know where her father is. You know, he's been taken ages ago now. You know, she doesn't know what's going to happen, you know, and there's that beautiful final moment of resistance which, you know, leads von Rumpel, but also of course Werner to her when she plays the Clare de Lune. So, you know, I guess what we see and why we continue going to that place is, I think Doerr saying, at the end of the day, when are we tested? Is it when things are going well or when things are going badly? And I think all three not all three. Von Rumpel obviously doesn't come out very well, but even he, towards the end, is thinking about his children, you know, and he's been diagnosed with a terminal cancer. So, you know, I guess he represents the opportunistic side of, you know, collaborators to the Nazi regime, you know, but at the end of the day, even he, at the end of his life, is thinking about his children. But both Werner and Marie-Laure, they're also thinking about their family. You know, they're thinking about, you know, he's thinking about the sister left behind in the orphanage. She's thinking about Uncle Etienne and her father, who she hasn't seen. And maybe that's what the message is, you know, what matters in life. It's not the diamonds that you're pursuing, this sea of flames, whatever. It's the connections that you make with other people, and that's what both of these characters have in common, and had in common even when they were young. They wanted to learn. They had really strong kind of parental figures, even if they weren't biological. And, you know, because of where they were born and circumstances, they had to kind of do different things to, you know, get that intellectual stimulation that they wanted. And, you know, I don't know whether it's up to me to judge what each character does. I think that's what, or, you know, students need to decide, depending on whatever question they get at the end of the year.
Yeah, I like that, this idea that, you know, you and I would approach the text in one way, but, you know, individual students, individual teachers discussing this text may be listening to this discussion right now and think, that's not at all how I see that character. And that's exactly what we want to facilitate, I think, as teachers, as assessors, as readers of literature. that Doerr has created this text and has, you know, constructed it. That's very clear. But
Yep.
it's almost, in the moment that that text is published and sent out into the world, that's where his control over its interpretation ends, and it's then up to us as the individual reader to determine what we draw from it. But what I'm hearing from you is, yes, obviously we need to be focused on Marie-Laure and Werner because they are the two protagonists. There is that binary there. They're the opposite ends of the spectrum, the kind of the yin and the yang, the boy and the girl, the French and the German, the two sides of the war.
Even the able and disabled. There's actually so many little, you know, things, strength and weakness. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So, and even, I mean, and this idea and this motif of light that is very obvious throughout the text.
Yeah, light and dark, all the light we cannot see. Exactly right.
Yes, but at the same time, to solely focus on their story would perhaps be detrimental to an interpretation. You know, possibly it's good to try and draw in our other characters.
Yeah, I think that, and what we have done at Lowther Hall in teaching this text is we always try to, of course, you know, as I said before, it's a bit like you can't ignore the fact there was a war. You know, you can't ignore that the bulk of the story is told from this narrative perspective of these two young people. But you can't, I mean, a good response can't ignore that there are other people too, and these are the people that influence the decisions that these protagonists make. You know, so I think that, you know, you probably couldn't write an essay without Marie-Laure or Werner, and it would be silly to try. But so, for example, you know, if you got a question about resistance, you know, yes, of course, Marie-Laure joins the resistance, but she's inspired by Madame Manec, you know, so a minor character, you know, but is so instrumental. And again, someone who traditionally would be seen as quite weak. She's older, she's a woman, you know, and yet the resistance in Saint-Malo in many ways. You know, same with Marie-Laure, you know, she's young and she's blind. You know, there's a moment in Paris where, you know, there's a moment at a park where kids talk to her how the Nazis are going to get, you know, the blind kids first, you know, and it's true, you know. It wasn't just Jewish people, of course. They were the largest cohort of people to be killed in Nazi Germany. But, you know, it was people that were infirm. It was homosexuals. It was all sorts of people. So, you know, it's quite right. She would be a target. So, you know, you might talk about Marie-Laure and the resistance, but you might pair that in a paragraph or in a response with Madame Manec and how she was kind of a mentor, a mother figure to her. And similarly, if you're talking about Werner, you might talk about his young sister Jutta as well, and how she acts as a moral compass for him, even way before you know, he goes off to Schulpforta and studies. You know, her letters are always kind of this kind of angel on his shoulder almost. And then, of course, at the school, Frederick, who again, oh God, he's so beautiful, and your heart.
But you know, it's almost, I knew he was going to. Well, I thought he was going to die. You know, horribly from the first moment I met him. The way that Doerr constructs him as so different to the rest of the boys, and so soft and gentle.
Exactly, and that, maybe it's because we're both mothers. I think one of the more poignant bits in the kind of aftermath, you know, the second last chapter where we hear from his mother, and he's in a vegetative state. You know, he might as well have died, really. But curiosity, you know, his love of birds, his that softness, yeah, that we just love. But of course, it's at odds against this whole regime, and of course, you know, he can hardly see again that motif of vision and perspective, perhaps, but yet he can see through this whole regime, and yet he's there because his dad is very high up. You know, he comes from a really rich family. There's kind of a summer recess where Werner goes and spends his time in Berlin with Frederick's family, and he's just amazed at how opulent it all is. And yet, you know, 30 years later, in the 70s, here he is, you know, with his mother. We don't know what became of the dad, but you know, she's kind of left to pick up the pieces. She's got now an incapacitated son, and no one's feeling sorry for these war widows, are they? In Germany, maybe, but not, I guess, Remembrance Day coming up and all the rest of it, we tend to kind of celebrate the victors. And of course, allies, at what cost? Well, but there were casualties on both sides, so I think it's a really interesting, as I said, and maybe we've both empathised with that because we're both mothers. I can't imagine being in a position where, I don't care if it's right or wrong. I don't want my kids to be in the battlefield. So maybe that's right. And you could tell from the very start that he was too soft, too gentle, too inquisitive, just too smart to be there. So is Werner, and he's there too. And so Frederick, you might kind of talk about Frederick and Werner in the same paragraph because they're similar ages and yet they are so, well, whether or not they are both on the same side, they have very different ideological positions. But they did what they felt they had to do in the circumstances. So, I think at the end of the day, I think it's a very sad but kind of bittersweet sort of story for most of the characters, because even those who survive have to live with what they saw for the rest of their lives. So I think that, considering that, that's what would hold the students in good stead. So Marie-Laure kind of, ends up doing what she always wanted to do. She also has a job at the National History Museum like her dad did. But she thinks about this stuff all the time. And that's why the meeting at the end between Jutta and Marie-Laure is so poignant, because we might get some sort of closure that we didn't get to have. I know a lot of my students kind of want Werner and Marie-Laure to end up kind of hooking up, It's like, no, I don't know if is it a romance? Probably not, but it is this idea that maybe in the second generation or maybe in subsequent generations we can say, gosh, we fought on opposite ends, but war is bad, ignorance is bad, that sort of thing. I know that's reducing, it's quite a reductive thing. You will say that in a much more eloquent way, but at its essence, I think that's what it is. So you've got Max, who is Jutta's young boy, who is described almost in almost identical terms to when we met Werner, very blonde, white hair, very curious about the world around him, like all kids are probably. Jutta, who's a teacher, again, I love her because we're all teachers, and she's kind of hunched over her essays. And she tries to forget the war, and Marie-Laure, by and large, she's probably just getting on with her life. But then you've got these kids and grandkids who are carrying on, and hopefully war doesn't return, but maybe the lessons we learn along the way, and that thread of humanity connects most of the characters, regardless of nationality, regardless of gender, regardless of ability. That's what the threads that kind of holds the whole story together, rather than whatever year it happens to be. Because as assessors too, can I, just as a caveat here too, I've never actually assessed the English exam, but my dear colleague Cathy Maloney did, and she used to say all the time, you know what, if you forget whether it was 1942 or 1943, that doesn't matter, because you know the story. I've read this novel probably 10 times and I couldn't think of Von Rumpel's name.
Yes.
I'm 20 years, I don't need to write the essay either, but, those details, yes, they're important, but if you kind of let something slide once in an essay, it's not going to be a disaster, because your assessor will know you know the text and you're responding critically to the question. So that's, I think that's why, at our school, a lot of our students were a bit put off at first, because they think we can't possibly know this 500-page tome back to front and forward to back. Well, you need to know it well enough. I'm not going to say there's no shortcuts. You need to read it several times. Maybe one weird blessing of this year is, we've got a little bit more time before the exam. You could probably do another read. But maybe you read the stuff that doesn't come straight to mind first. Did you just skip over the last quarter of the text because, you were doing it in term 2 and, you thought, oh gosh, I just need to skim read this. This will be enough for the SAC. that's cool. Now's your time to start over and maybe you know, focus on that last quarter, because you already know the first 3 quarters really well. So I think that the way to go from here on in, if you have chosen to write on this novel for the exam.
And I think reading for intent too, on a second or a third or a fourth reading, is really effective. Having some key ideas. I'm worried just to use the word theme in isolation, but I think
absolutely.
Thinking about, what is it that Doerr is intending to communicate to us as readers? He has constructed a text with an intent, and then I guess trying to find, just as maybe Marie-Laure found all the little tips and tricks to get into the beautiful boxes that her father whittled for her. I think Doerr has constructed the text in a similar way. I was particularly taken with a quote which I'm not sure has anything more important in the larger reading of the text, but I'm interested to hear what you think. This is when Werner is trying to find out illegal transmissions, and he's listening. He's going around with Volkheimer and the Newmans. Werner records what he overhears, and he says everybody he is learning likes to hear themselves talk. Hubris, like the oldest stories. They raise the antenna too high, broadcast for too many minutes, assume the world offers safety and rationality, when of course it does not. And I just think, in the context of us podcasting about this text, like there's almost a subtle irony that we are right now recording our thoughts about this text that was focused on him. But
is that when he's in Vienna?
1943. He's hunting.
They're on the Eastern Front, because one of my favourite, it might not be, because I'm sorry, I don't have the novel in front of me either, but I love that too, that idea about hubris. And I love what I said to some of the kids earlier this year, or might have been last year, what is time anymore? But it's a bit like, there's like Netflix series or those podcasts, like these true crime ones, like murderers kind of always leave little clues almost, and it's here, like it's almost like, kind of human nature to want to be seen, to want to be heard. It is, it's quite ironic. Who cares about 2 English teachers yakking on about a text?
Right.
We do.
I'd like to think someone does.
Maybe, hopefully.
Yeah.
But it is almost that irony though, that's why people got caught. And especially, look, again, to draw maybe a clunky link to what we're going through now, we've been in lockdown for, it seems like forever, but it's only been a few months. So by 1943, these are people that have lived under these kind of conditions of war for 4 years or more, So I think it's easy to understand, maybe it's easier to understand now, well, gosh, if you're going to be intercepted, why would you do it? Or if why would you go outside with your kids if you think, we barely last 4 minutes, let alone 4 years, And I think I think it's a bit of hubris, but that's coming from Werner's narrative perspective, and he's only a young person himself. I think, maybe that's why I love this novel too. And I think if students can try and cast away the length of it and the characters and the fact that it goes back and forth, and I know some students think, but I don't really know enough about the history. We're in English, we're not in history. Of course, some knowledge of the history, would be beneficial.
I think Doerr gives us almost
he does.
History.
He gives us a lot.
Yeah.
And I think
wouldn't need to know any more.
And it's a text response, it's responding to what he's put in front of us. And I think it's a bit like saying you need to know all about how the radio works. I have no idea, but we learn that almost through Werner. Yeah, all the maths. Oh gosh. And that's what I think, that's what the beautiful thing about this novel is. There's that kind of, the characters know a lot more than we could almost, about music. They've got different expertise, right? We've got, Marie-Laure and the mollusks. We've got
Uncle Etienne and his knowledge of the radio. But then you've got all these references to the music and the literature, and that's, you know, the arts is what really, again, another thing that ties all the characters together. You know, it's the maths and the science. You're the pure logic cadet, and of course, yeah, that's what a motif or a recurring line that Werner hears from a lot of his superiors. But then, and then you've also got Marie-Laure's father Daniel, who kind of talks about, you know, he's a locksmith, and that's very, again, it's something that does rely on logic. It's precise, yes, but life is not, you know, so that precision, that logic, when it comes to life or death matters, sometimes it leaves all the characters at some point, you know, and what do they get returned to? There's the Clare de Lune, there's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, these fictional novels that Marie-Laure is reading in Braille. And the Clare de Lune, you know, when they hear that broadcast towards the end of the novel, you know, they all kind of have to stop. And, you know, it's like a bit like we're, you know, kind of stopped in our tracks by a song that we hear. It might be an old childhood favourite, or it might be something that you hear for the first time. Or when we kind of latch onto a quote. And I love what you said there. I don't even know if it matters in the context of it. You know what? It mattered to you, and you had an interpretation of it. And that's why I say to the kids when they say, Miss, what are the 20 quotes I need to know about this novel? What are your 20 quotes? And I don't care if they're different to the person next to you.
Absolutely. I prefer it.
Can you? Yeah, absolutely. Are you going to remember it?
The essays.
Yes.
You know, if we're sitting there and reading, I think for students to understand that even as your teacher will sit there and read 20, 30 essays in a row, and if they read the same 20 quotes over and over again, I talk to my students about my pen accidentally poking myself in my eye. You know, I just like, give me something different, give me something unique that makes
a different perspective.
That makes
and that doesn't mean
notice.
Make you think and make you notice, exactly, especially when you're, you know, if again, I had a colleague at Ballarat Clarendon College who used to say, you know, just think of a really cranky, maybe just even think of your teacher, you know, if they were like me, sometimes I used to get a bit cranky, sleep deprived, you know, they've taught their own classes from 9 till 3:30, and then they go home and they've got to smash out 20 essays or more each night, and they've probably got their own families, they've had to cook, they've had to put them to bed, so don't piss them off. He used to say, don't piss off the examiner, you know, and I think I say that to my kids. Sorry if any of my bosses are listening. Do you know what? You want to be clear, but you also, again, examiners read what's there, not what's not there, you know, so we're not looking for any secret weapon. What we're looking for is, do you know the text? Are you answering the question? And that little X factor of, oh my goodness, even if it's just one beautiful sentence that ties, you know, a motif or something about the construction, you know, don't try to be deliberately obscure either. You know, that's what I'm saying. You can't ignore the fact that most of it's about the war and most of it is seen through these protagonists' point of view. So, you know, don't try and write a whole essay on Von Rumpel. You can't, or you could, but you probably wouldn't do that well. But you could maybe, if you know that novel well enough, you might be able to just do a kind of a sentence or two within a broader paragraph about you know, a particular character like Marie-Laure, and you will show the assessor that you have not only read and reread this novel, probably talk to your dog or your mum about it, but that you've understood it and you've got your own point of view about it, and it's not just come from this podcast or a lesson that you did with your teacher back in March or a study guide. All of those things are important, and that's what I'd say. I'm not dismissing that. You know, I wrote one of them and I'm participating in this. Read it, but then be brave enough to say, I don't agree with that. But to say that, you need to have your own perspective and you need to be able to confidently assert that in writing. So, you know, the only way to get there, and as I said, I've read this novel so many times, and I think that's the beauty of it. Each time you might find something new, and it's a bit like that true detective, that kind of detective stuff. You know, what's he trying to say? And I reckon my favourite character changes every time I read it. So that's the beauty of it. I think it rewards multiple reads, and it will definitely, the English exam, you will definitely, there won't be any wasted time for that extra, even if you only have time to read one chapter. Okay, read the one chapter that you go, I don't get that. Just read the hard bits first. It will pay off eventually, I promise.
We hope so. We hope so.
We hope so. We hope so.
No, I think so. I think what you say is very, very true, and would apply regardless of if you're studying All the Light or any of the texts. And because in section A of the exam, in that text response, you, as a student, you are invited to determine whether or not you agree, or to discuss an idea, which is very different to the comparative, where you're really not. There's not that same allowance of clarification, I guess, or you're just presented with, this is a theme. It is a theme that connects the two. Go and discuss.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, and you might get a kind of thematic kind of question in section A. So please don't. I love when kids say, "Well, it's an interpretation." So if it's a question of, I don't know, All the Light We Cannot See is a story about love, discussed. You still need, even if you disagree with that premise, you still need to, you can't say in the first line, it's not about love, it's about war, and then ignore the premise of the question. Do you know what I mean? So you still need to work within the parameters of what it's asking.
You need to prove why it's not love, really.
Yes,
you need to
that's right.
There's twice as much work there to disagree.
Absolutely.
Which isn't a reason not to disagree. I actually would advocate
absolutely
challenging.
Yeah, debate, and a lot of English students might also be debaters, and we know that, oh God, I loved being on the opposing side every time because I'm going to argue my way out of it. As long as you know your stuff, you can be antagonistic, but you need to know your stuff. Don't just argue for the sake of it, because you know what, you're arguing against English teachers, and the good thing is that you will have at least 2 sets of eyes on your All the Light essay. But these are assessors who have also read the novel multiple times and know it inside out. So, they will pick up. Don't worry, they'll if it's not an obvious quote, they'll know. And again, as long as you know it well, and you're not, don't make up quotes, don't do anything silly. As long as you can prove that you're able to weave it in, go for your life. As you say, I'm excited when someone presents me with a quote that I have to actually check in my novels. I'm like, did she actually say that? And then I look it up and go, yeah, bravo, you've actually done that. You haven't just kind of Googled All the Light quotes. You've actually done
the work yourself. That Spark Notes provided.
Yeah, exactly. And they're a great resource too, but they're supplementary to the novel itself.
I wonder then, does that bring us around to, the goal of today was to start with, why do you love the text, and then to come around to why has VCAA book listed it? Why is it on this text list? Why is it so important? Because I would argue that every text on the text list is selected for a reason.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I know we've touched on it, but I'd love your opinion on what is it? What's the point? What's the point of all the light?
I think that the point is, there's kind of, I'm not a history student, I never studied it, but I think that kind of old saying of history repeats, or if it doesn't repeat, it rhymes. I think that we're at a moment in time, and again, Anthony Doerr has said this, but it doesn't matter what he says. You have your interpretation. But basically, it was like an anniversary quite recently here of VP Day, of the Victory in Pacific, and there's very few survivors of World War II. There are some, but they're very old now, and that's why probably my favourite chapter in the whole novel is the very last, where it's just Marie-Laure and her grandson. And she talks about, how she basically talks about that a lot of people that were there have died. So how do we remember?
Quote, actually, she says, every hour someone whom the war was memory falls out of the world.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And I think in there, it's about memory, it's about remembering. And for me, I think it is, why do we tell these stories? Why do we, why are we podcasting? Why do VCAR select these? And it's not, I think it's easy to say, I know some students will say, why has VCAR done this to us? Well, it's not VCAR. Your school had chosen that, and they've chosen it for a reason. So if your school has chosen, it's not because we're all mean English teachers. I know, we debated it at length actually when we put this novel on, because it is a really dense novel.
It's not one that every school would want necessarily to use. Yeah.
No, yeah. And we understand why, and I think we really, English teachers, and so I love this podcast, Claire, because I think these are the kinds of debates we have. And I know that the English teaching team that I'm a part of, there's probably other texts that some of them would have preferred as well. It's really hard. It's a hard job. And what are we trying to do? We're trying to, I guess it goes down to the point of why do we write? Why do we read? I think the point why VCAR put this on there, well, first of all, there's several. First of all, we talked about Pulitzer Prize. It's got literary merit. It's an outstanding work of literary fiction, historical fiction at that. Okay, so, if you read this novel, even if you don't know anything else about World War II and even World War I, because of course Etienne is traumatised by the events of World War I. So, you get a kind of a basic awareness of kind of global politics in a way, and these historical events. So there's that. But I think if your school has chosen to do it, they haven't done it to punish you. I think that there is, because it's so long, because the opposite can be true. I've taught really short plays or short stories or poems, and sometimes that can be harder because you've actually got less to go on. I say sometimes, without being reductive and just cherry picking bits of the novel, there is so much you can latch onto. It doesn't mean ignore the bits that you don't get, but there's no way you could ever write about every single character, every single event in this novel. And I think that actually could be advantageous to you, because if you love a certain character, I knew students who would always write about Etienne or would always write about Madame Manette, and again, could only be a sentence or two, but again, it's enough for a necessor to say that. So I think, why is it on the list? There's lots in there which you can see as a blessing or a curse.
Let's see it as a blessing.
I would as well.
See it as a blessing. Yeah,
try to see it as a blessing.
Yes.
But I think at the end of the day, I always try and, when I'm arguing for a text to be on our personal schools list, I think, well, how is reading this novel going to help this young person to navigate the world? And, gosh, if you're a student listening to this, you're going to say, ugh, that is such a wanky English thing to say. And I get it, because, all of us English teachers were real English nerds. That's why we've never really left school. But it's true. For mine, I think, is it going to be a novel that obviously has literary merit, but I think that there's so many different World War II kind of historical fiction novels that you could read, and there's probably better ones, or it's such a matter of personal taste. But I think it's really beautiful, and it's in kind of that kind of literary tradition of a lot of novels that maybe kids have also read and studied, such as kind of The Boy in the Striped Pajamas or Night, where they're a young protagonist. So that's why I also think VCAR have done it. These are people, Marie-Laure and Werner, are your age. In normal times, they would be in year 11 or 12 by the time, the war came around. So, these are just kids, and they, in a lot of ways, their kind of fate or their destiny, whatever you want to call it, is out of their hands. And maybe it's always out of our hands and we just kind of fool ourselves into thinking we have control. But I think that's why VCAR have done it. That's our idea that, we can have really bright ideas about, our conscience and acting in an admirable way. But, I hope I never have to worry about a world war. It's almost like, are we on this precipice? We've been thinking, it's been a long time since World War II, and of course there's been wars and devastating wars, and I personally come from a place of great privilege, even in lockdown Melbourne, where, I've never had to worry about the food on my table, or if, if I'm going to be caught in a physical conflict like that. But certainly I've taught students have been, if they've emigrated here. So I think that's why it's on the list. I think the point of it is what makes us human. And I think if even a German boy and a French girl in World War II can act in a humane way, not even all the time. You know, these are imperfect, flawed characters. And that's the other thing. You know, no one is wholly good, no one is wholly evil. You can be maybe a, you know, yeah, I don't know. Anyway, that's another discussion altogether. But I think that's what it is. When it distills, you know, at that kind of that moment in your life where it's do or die, how do you behave? You know, and so I know students who think Werner's kind of involvement in the war makes him a reprehensible character, and that's okay. You can say that, absolutely, of course.
He dies at the end, so arguably Doerr punishes him. You know, he doesn't get to live.
Exactly.
Yeah,
maybe that's part of it. But I think Volkheimer survives, and in his chapter, in that penultimate section of the text, he has lived. But what kind of life is it? It's an absolute, you know, he lives with this regret all the time, you know, of his part in the war, and even the fact that Werner died, and he's kind of like a father figure to him. But he's only a couple of years older. So this is the thing. I think that's why we get the perspectives of young people, because for the most part, decisions are out of their hands. And when push comes to shove, I guess, even Werner acts in an admirable way. So I think that the intent, again, doesn't matter if it's not successful for you personally. I think Doerr's intent is for us as the readers to see even people like Werner, who've been sucked into this Nazi war machine, to see them as essentially good people. And if it wasn't for the war, he probably would have been a brilliant scientist. Don't forget Einstein. You know, a lot of these preeminent thinkers you know, are in Germany. You know, it's a first world country. It still is. In fact, it's you know, even to this day, you know, a powerhouse in Europe, and you know, all these sorts of things. So I think at the end of the day, it's what makes us human, and it's you know, loving each other. It is having these kind of family or friendship ties. It's looking after each other. It's the world of maybe music and science and art and literature, that, you know, even if you're a poor person from Germany or kind of a more affluent Parisian, you can enjoy that, you know, because it's about what makes you tick rather than how much money you have in your account. I think that's basically what it's all about. And it's about trying to be as good as you can be given the resources you have at your disposal, you know. So I think I'm more inclined to judge someone more harshly in the novel if they could have done better but they didn't. Do you know what I mean? So for example, someone like von Rumpel, even, you know, he's a man of means, you know, whereas Werner, I'm pretty sympathetic to him, to be honest, because he's a poor orphan who didn't want to die in the mines, and that was going to be his fate. It's inevitable almost. You know, even if he didn't die there, he would just be there kind of slogging away for the rest of his life. And what
fearful of death.
Yeah. He basically wanted to go to uni and learn about science and technology, and the only way that he could do that was to go to this academy. So I think I'm kind of sympathetic to that. That doesn't mean that I'm a Nazi sympathiser, just
no, goodness no.
as well.
But is that what Doerr is showing us, is that we can have sympathy or sympathy for a young German boy, that's okay.
And I think that that beautiful meeting between Marie-Laure and Doerr. Doerr says something along the lines of, it was not easy. It was not easy for him to do, or he had to do what was expected to him. I'm so sorry. I should have found the quote. I could find it. But it's and it's great. It's a great moment because one of them is, you know, she's obviously German and Marie-Laure's French, and she's trying to speak French, and she's remembering what Frau Eleanor, you know, kind of, you can remember even in Children's House, the orphanage, Doerr's obsessed with Paris. So she, you know, she's gone to Paris to meet this woman, you know, with her young son, and she's imperfect in her speech, which I think is beautiful because there's also the kind of the weight of the emotions of she's tried to forget her brother for all these years. And remember, you know, in the aftermath of the war, she is, you know, really young too. You know, she's younger than Werner was even, and you know, she's kind of raped and awful things happen. So
that chapter just happens, doesn't it? So
awful.
shockingly, and then it's over, and and it's not blink and you miss it, kind of, if you're reading really quickly.
Yeah. It's awful. And
Yeah.
I think that I think a really basic message is war is no good. But what do? Do you judge people just because they're in a particular uniform? And and one of the great points of discussion is Marie-Laure. Would she have trusted Werner if she could see him? Because obviously, he's in a uniform that, if I would tell my daughter, you avoid that uniform at all costs, right? But she can't see. And Werner often wonders, does she know? Does she not? To me, it doesn't really matter, because at that moment when she needed someone to be kind to her and someone to rescue, it's almost like a damsel in distress, which is problematic maybe, but he does the right thing. He does what he believes is the morally right thing to do, and I guess what most of us in the West would say the same thing. He did the right thing, even though, of course, if his own kind of side had have thought of that, he had have found out, he would be punished for it too. But he did the right thing at the right time, and that allowed Marie-Laure obviously to prosper as she did. Yeah.
Live a long life.
Live a long life, yeah. And and I think that's I think that's why I love the last bit of the novel, because that aftermath of it, the war ends in 1945, but if you're there, it doesn't. It lives in the memories, and it dictates perhaps how you choose to proceed in life, if you get that opportunity at all, if you're a survivor. So whether you did the right thing or wrong thing, you have to live with that, so you live with your conscience, and post-traumatic stress disorder, all those sorts of things.
There's so many layers to even like
so many.
Yeah.
But you don't need to be an expert in all of it or any of it. Just
pick what you think's really interesting of many different facets of the novel, and then deep dive a little bit into that to develop your interpretation.
Exactly.
Yeah. I think that's the thing. I feel like we keep falling into rabbit holes as we discuss, as we kind of, we go, and then there's that, and we need to, and then there's that. Yeah. But that's arguably that's what makes it such a fabulous text. A fabulous text to study, and one that will also perhaps last the whole year. It's another thing to think about, because the reading like you said at the start, and what you've written on in your Unit 3 SAC is not going to be the essay that you write for your exam.
And it's always say, as teachers and as assessors, you cannot go in with a pre-prepared sort of set of things. As I said, I had a student last year who would always write about a particular character, but she wouldn't always write about them in the same way. It would depend on the question, so of course it's like, you don't go into the extreme of, I'm not going to prepare anything because I don't know what's going to be on the exam.
No.
Of course but equally you need to know, you need to be confident enough in writing about the text that it doesn't matter what, the VCAR aren't there to try and trick you.
No.
You're not going, and you've got it, and that's the other beauty of it, you've got a choice of two. So if there is one that you think, I don't want to write on that, hopefully if you know this not well enough, there'll be one that you'll be able to run with. And that's the beauty of Section A.
I agree. Thank you so much, Carla. This has been a wonderful conversation that I feel possibly could continue for another hour and another, and maybe we'll have to meet again to talk on this text again. I feel even though I'm having these discussions, one discussion is actually not enough to talk all that there is. But I'm so grateful for your time, especially, which we didn't say at the start, that you are on maternity leave at the moment and juggling a little baby. What a woman.
Coming.
Coming.
My toddler has just woken up, so we're going to go, and it's actually, I don't know if this will make it to the podcast, but it's Father's Day, and we love this, but this is what your teachers are doing. We mark your essays and we do all that because we love our kids and we love you. You're our kids too. So all we wanted you to do in that exam, and again, similarly to, you can't cover it all in an hour, you can't cover it all in 1 hour exam either. You do your best you can, and you answer that question, and you just do the best you can, and you can do the best you can if you put in the work now. So good luck, everyone. There's still time. That's it. There's lots of time. It's an hour is not a long time, maybe, to write about the novel, but it's got to be long enough if you know the text and you're able to choose your best examples. So good luck, everyone, and to the teachers, and particularly my dear colleague Cathy Maloney, who was an assessor for many, many years. It's a great text to teach. It's a great text to write on. It's a great text to assess. Just enjoy it if you can.
Thanks, Carla.
You're welcome. Nice to speak with you.
Thanks everyone for listening to this episode. If you like what you've heard today, please subscribe to us on whatever platform you are listening.